we're going to get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I am Yukasha Bakshi. I'm a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech, and I'm going to be moderating this side event. This side event has been put together by a few of us from Virginia Tech and also with valuable contribution from the Water Research Foundation. Now, the objective for the next 90 minutes is to explore the importance of trust in the context of water. We will be discussing and exploring strategies for building and maintaining trust among stakeholders, addressing both challenges and potential solutions. And our hope is that after this side event, you'll be able to walk away with the understanding of the significance of the impact of trust and trustworthiness in various water-related contexts. You'll see a sign-in sheet that's probably floating around, so feel free to check it while we get started. So to begin with, we'll briefly set the stage and acknowledge the significance of trust in the water sector. Following this, we'll do a quick activity to get us all thinking about it, more deeply about trust in our work. And then we have three experts in the field who will be presenting their work, and I'll be introducing them in a few minutes. Subsequently, we'll transition into a panel discussion and giving you all the opportunity to ask questions, interact with the presenters, and also delve a little bit deeper into the topics that are being addressed today. And finally, we'll wrap up with some closing remarks. So it is only fair to start the side event with this question about why trust and why do we think it deserves the attention that it does. And there have been quite a few studies that have been commissioned by various organizations in the past few years that have looked at public trust in water, and the results have been alarming. The results reveal a steady erosion of trust in the water utilities, and the results have also revealed that the people's trust to act in interest, the utilities interest to act in the sector, especially when it comes to environmental justice and so on, has fallen, and the trust to provide a reliable service in ensuring good quality water has also fallen. The trust has also been showing up in research in the last 5, 10, 20 years, been steadily increasing. If you look at academia, where publication of articles have increased thrice as much since the 2000s. It's a cornerstone in effective water governance. We all know that, we all acknowledge that. And without trust, cooperation between residents, utilities, and stakeholders breaks down. So today we're going to explore how trust is built, challenged, and sustained in water governance systems worldwide. And like I said, just to get us thinking a little bit about trust a little more deeply, the quick activity plan for you guys before we get into presentations and panel discussion. And I'm going to make the most advantage of the caffeine that should be kicking in by now. So you already have, I guess, sticky notes. If you don't, we'll pass them around again. But jot down your answers to the questions that you see on the slide. What makes you trust and what makes you distrust in one? Think about the different characteristics, behaviors, when answering these questions. Be as brief as possible, be as wordy as you want to be. And let's take maybe 2 to 3 minutes for this. We're also starting to build out a board, so feel free to get up and paste your sticky notes in the right column. And yeah.
Folks stop and put them on. Yeah. For each idea that you have, remind me to sit before it, and we'll get you where to be. There, like what's already up here?
So we can have a
We're gonna be perfect.
During the course of this, I then feel free to like move around, check out the board in the middle if you need to see what your peers think about distrust and trust. And might give you some ideas, might inform your decision making in the future. But thank you so much. And we will transition into presentations, and we're going to come back and kind of reflect on your personal answers. You're not required to do a public share out, but if you want to, that'd be great. We're definitely going to be reflecting on how the presentations and the panel discussion kind of informs your thinking about how you trust or distrust someone. And with that, I will introduce the first speaker for today. Dr. Mark Stern is a professor in the Department of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech. His research examines human behavior in a number of contexts, including collaborative natural resource management, public planning processes, environmental conflict, and environmental communications and education. His recent book, Social Science Theory for Environmental Sustainability, a practical guide published by Oxford University Press, translates decades worth of social science knowledge into practical and usable principles for practitioners. His work on trust ecology, first published in 2015, has been cited nearly 1,000 times and has become a common framework for federal agencies and others in managing relationships with public stakeholders. And with that, I welcome Dr. Stern.
All right, let me unmute. And then Yugasha, can you enable me to share
Yes.
screen?
You should have permission now.
Okay. Great. All right, are we good to go? Can you all see?
I make it larger.
Okay. All right, well, while that is getting larger on the screen there, I'll begin. First off, thanks, Yugasha, for inviting me. It's great to be with you all. I'm going to be talking about a theoretical framework for thinking about trust. There's a lot of frameworks out there. I'm just going to be sharing one of them that's emerged from my own research and that of my graduate students over the past 20 years or so. And that work's emerged from looking at protected areas management in the United States, in Asia, and in South America and the Caribbean. I'm looking at public involvement processes of federal agencies, primarily in the United States and Canada. I'm looking at large-scale collaborative landscape programs where multiple stakeholders are trying to sort out their differences to figure out what to do on hundreds of thousands of acres or hectares at a time. Some work in international conservation and development projects, which often include elements of water provision. And also some direct work in trust in water authorities. It also emerges from standing on the shoulders of others. So part of our work has been looking across the literature on trust, particularly in psychology and organizational psychology, to really understand what are the common themes that can really help us. So our focus has been on collaborative natural resource management and the settings in which that takes place. So just to get started here, we haven't yet defined what trust means. So I would love for anyone in the room or for folks online to use the chat to throw down some definitions. What do you think trust is? How do you define it? And I promise in about 1 minute after I give you a chance, I will tell you what the nerdy psychological definition of trust is. Does anybody want to give it a shot? Is there a volunteer in the room, Yugasha?
Yes, there is. I'm just. Okay.
I've got willingness to be vulnerable based on expectations being met. Something about vulnerability, something about meeting expectations and consistency.
All right, so I heard when expectations are met, or the expectation that they will be met. Good.
Also would like to add that she already said was willingness to be vulnerable.
Ah, great. Okay, so we probably all have a sense of what trust is. The official definition that we like to use, there are other definitions. The one that we use here is a willingness to accept vulnerability in the face of uncertainty. So for trust to matter, there has to be some degree of risk, something that's at stake. Otherwise, trust isn't that important. However, when we work in natural resource management or in water provision, there's always something at stake. So trust is almost always of high relevance. And Yugasha got you started by thinking about why you trust people or why you don't. And if you really think about this, you might think about it contextually, right? Why do you trust somebody maybe to write the introduction to a report that you have due? Right? You could think about what would make you trust that person. What would make you trust somebody to look after your son or daughter for the evening? Is it the same thing? It might be a completely different set of determinants that enable you to trust that person. So what I'm going to share is a framework that helps us think through what are the different forms of trust that can emerge, because they're quite different when you think about how trust develops. So I'm going to just start by saying I developed this with a lot of other people. The primary other co-authors on this are Kim Coleman and Tim Baird. And I'm going to lead you through at least 4 different types of trust that we've identified in our research and across the literature that we think are helpful to think through how do you actually do things like effective water provision and natural resource management. So the first form of trust, if you really want to think about it, I usually like to get a show of hands for this one, but are you the type of person who, when you meet somebody, generally you trust them unless they prove distrustworthy in some way? You give people the benefit of the doubt, right? When you first meet somebody, that would be high level of dispositional trust. Some of us are more skeptical, right? When we meet somebody, they have to earn your trust. Now, as a communicator or a manager or a provider of a utility, there's not much we can do about predispositions that other people have, right? However, understanding people's predispositions helps us understand the baseline that we're working with, right? So when people show up to public meetings about water provision, do you think they're starting out with a high level of trust, or are they somewhere else? Well, probably if they're showing up to a public meeting about this, they don't trust us entirely, because if they did, why would they bother showing up, right? So we know that we're at this baseline of at least a lack of trust or some distrust is involved. And we really need to think about how can we build trust in those populations to make things work, and to at least enable us to do our job as well. So again, dispositional trust as a communicator, there's not much you can do. It's really based on people's personal histories, what's happened to them in their past, traumas perhaps, their family culture, and maybe their village culture as well. The other 3 forms of trust I'm going to share are actionable. You as a manager, you as a communicator can actually strongly influence these other forms of trust. So the first one is, I think, what we heard in our first response when I asked, what is trust? And it's whether expectations are fulfilled. So we call this rational trust. Okay, and this is calculus based. So I make a prediction of how you'll behave. And if I'm pretty confident that your behavior is going to benefit me, then I will trust you. Okay, so we call this is rational cognitive thinking. So this is based on consistent performance, keeping promises, being good at what we do, demonstrating that we can provide safe drinking water over time, right? So these are all the sort of business level kind of trust elements that we think of. So oftentimes when I ask this question, when I'm presenting to Western audiences, particularly in the United States and Canada, like what makes you trust? This is often the answer that I get. But we also know that humans aren't always very rational beings. We're not just doing calculations. This should ring true to you when you think about how many times you've met somebody that immediately you just had this intuition about them and you thought, wow, I really love that person. Or you might have met somebody and the exact opposite happened. Maybe they reminded you of your least favorite politician or something like that. Or they might remind you of your little sister or your best friend. So this can happen sort of intuitively and emotionally. And there's a lot of research out there these days that suggests that we as human beings very rarely are all that rational, weighing costs and benefits of a relationship. Oftentimes, we act based on our intuitions and then we post hoc rationalize it, right? So we convince ourselves that what we did was rational, but we make our decisions emotionally sometimes. So we call this second form of trust that emerges from emotions affinitive trust, because it develops from an affinity for the trustee, whether that trustee is an individual or an organization. And this can come from a lot of places. It can be that sort of intuitive reaction, but it could also be based on shared positive experiences or assumptions of similar values that I might have. So oftentimes this takes place when we've spent some time together. As the potential trustee, that being somebody who can be trusted, maybe I look you in the eye and I nod and I show you that I understand what you're saying and I demonstrate that I care. Maybe we've gone on field trips together and shared stories about our families. Or maybe we've just demonstrated that we really care about something and we can work on it together. So I put this quote up here from Stephen Covey, who wrote this very famous book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I love it because if you think about this quote, right, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. I guess I'll just think about how often we're guilty of that second thing. And if we can shift from that second thing to the first, where we're really listening to understand and demonstrate that we understand and try our best to be responsive, we can start to build this other form of trust, this demonstration of caring, that we actually are good people trying to do the best for other people. Okay, so we've got these two forms of interpersonal trust, rational trust, which develops from being good at what we do, demonstrating our competence. Then we have this emotional side, which really comes from demonstrating that we're good people and we care. Okay? The third form of actionable trust I'd like to share isn't so much interpersonal or interorganizational. Oh, and before I go on, I should mention that you might also, these same sort of categories of theory, they apply to distrust as well. So if we think about rational distrust, if you're a consistent performer and you always provide water for me in an effective way, I might rationally trust you. But if every time I meet you, you punch me in the stomach, I will rationally distrust you, right? So it's not just a matter of consistency and performance. It's a matter of consistency performance with a positive valence, right? That it's actually doing good things for me. Same with affinitive trust, right? We can have affinitive distrust where I feel like I know you really well and I'm pretty confident I can predict that you're going to be a bad person, right? So we see this in politics sometimes in particular. Okay, so this third form of active trust we call systems-based trust. And rather than trust in an individual or an organization, it's trust in the system that we create in which we interact. So you could think about this in a very simplistic way, like in water governance systems. If there's some form of accountability that ensures there are really strong incentives or penalties for a water governance system to do their job, this can make us all feel safer when we interact because there's checks and balances on that governance system. A lot of the places in which I work, there's efforts that go beyond sort of just a distant water authority and like the people they serve. Oftentimes there's a lot of interaction. When that happens, there's a lot more that needs to go into building a trustworthy system. Okay, so we start in the simplest sense of transparency and fair rules and procedures with accountability. That'll apply to any system. But once we get people engaged and like coming to meetings and being upset, then we need to rethink this. How do we create a system that's a safe space for productive disagreement, right? We want disagreement because when that happens, when multiple parties are engaged, we get better ideas. We also understand the problem more holistically. So typically what we see is these bullets that you're looking at now are what tend to create those trustworthy systems. And if you have a really trustworthy system, it usually creates a space in which those two interpersonal forms can more easily develop. So oftentimes that involves a jointly developed set of procedures. So I work on some projects in the United States called the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, where there are dozens of stakeholder groups. There's individuals, landowners, nonprofit organizations, multiple levels of government. And oftentimes at the beginning of that, they'll spend the first 6 months to a year developing a charter for how are we going to do work together? How do we communicate? What are the rules for membership in this group that's going to talk about this? What happens when we disagree? How do we make decision making? So all of those criteria are set up. And if they're set up nicely, when there is disagreement down the road, we can fall back on the rules we created to deal with that disagreement. So an example of this, I worked with about eight of these groups. One group did that. They spent the first 12 months when they created a new charter to just come up with those rules. And this was one of the most conflicted places in the United States prior to this beginning. And what we found was that group, after spending all that time, was able to do work and really work across conflict pretty well. Whereas another group, they kind of all knew each other ahead of time. They felt like, well, you know what we'll do? We'll start with the small projects on which we agree. And we'll build on those small agreements, right? You've probably all felt this, like, let's get some small wins and then we'll be able to work together more in bigger and bigger ways. And what happened with that group is they worked pretty well together for a few months. And then there was a disagreement that blew up, not on the land they were working on, but on an adjacent land. They had no way to deal with it. They got upset with each other and the entire thing collapsed. And they couldn't work together for about 12 months after that, until they brought in an external facilitator and decided to start over again and write a charter for how they were going to work together. So what does this look like when you actually work together? So I've got all these bullets here. Some of these, so I talked about jointly developing procedures, and transparency just means everyone knows what they are. But then I've got these other sort of strange phrases, and these come from a very famous book called Getting to Yes. This is from the Harvard Negotiation Project. And they suggest, well, when you have these difficult disagreements, you really want to separate people's interests from their positions. So a position is what people want to see happen. It's like the end policy, right? An interest is the reason why they have that position. Okay, so in my work, it might be whether you put a road inside a national park or not. So the positions are road, no road. But the interests are, why do you want the road? Or why don't you? So you can imagine the road advocates might say something like, oh, we want access to that area for recreation, and it'll bring economic benefits to the community if more tourists come. Whereas the folks against the road might say, well, we're concerned about the environment and ecosystem impacts here, and maybe we're also concerned about crowding. Okay, so I just identified 4 interests. Now, if we could put those interests up on a whiteboard and everyone can agree that those are valid interests, it puts us in a different place to have productive argument about what to do, right? If we're just arguing road, no road, we don't get anywhere, but we get down to interest and we can actually get somewhere. And by putting them on the board, we can get to this next bullet point. We can say, all right, whatever pathway we're going to take, that those bullets we just agreed are valid, that's our criteria for decision making. And it separates takes some of the heat out of the argument when we can look at those and say, all right, well, how does it affect those 4 things we just put on the board? This second to last bullet about consequences, this is something called graduated sanctions by Elinor Ostrom. The idea is there's rules for if you break one of the agreements we make in our pre-existing charter, there are some second chances, but there's also consequences, right? So that, yeah, here's what happens. It's kind of like, for those of you who've ever done teaching with little kids, like you need to tell them what the rules are, because otherwise it gets emotional when they break them. But if they know what the rules are, if they break one, you say, oh, well, you broke one of the rules we agreed on. Here are the consequences that we already agreed on. It makes it a lot easier to work together. Okay, so that's a lot of detail there. But basically what we're trying to do is create a safe space for disagreement, where we can actually have productive arguments rather than ones that attack each other. We want to attack the problem. Right? Okay, so in summary, we've got these different types of trust. Okay, so there's rational trust, which is really the exchange type of trust. Do I expect that you are going to do a good job? And we do it consistently. Okay, so if we want to influence that, we're consistent at what we do, we communicate the benefits well, we prove our competence. Affinitive trust. Interestingly enough, in a lot of the research I do, this form of trust oftentimes is more important than rational trust in terms of predicting behavior. So if you want to do your job well, it's not just about being good at your job, it's actually about being a good person and being kind and nice to people and responsive. That actually creates better management setup. And the last one is the systems-based trust that I just talked about. Okay, so here's the punchline and why we call this thing trust ecology. We've got these 4 types of trust. Dispositional, I mentioned, there's not much we can do about that one except understand the baseline. But these others are all actionable. We can do things about them. And what our research has been showing, and the research of others who've been using this framework, it seems to show that you can succeed in the short term with only one form of trust. So if you have a really charismatic leader, it's high affinitive trust, everybody loves that person. Okay, that's fine, you can succeed. But what happens when that person gets promoted and they move away? The entire network of governance can crash. So we call this trust ecology because we're seeing, just like diversity in an ecosystem confers resilience, so does diversity and trust to a collaborative group. So in order to work and be resilient over the long term, we need to focus on all 3 of these forms of trust within a governance arrangement. So in an ecosystem, right, a big storm comes in, wipes out a few pollinators. Well, if there's other pollinators around, the ecosystem can recover. Here in a collaborative governance setting, if there's a rational trust failure, for example, somebody drops the ball and, oh my gosh, there's chemicals in the water. Well, if we have these other 2 forms of trust, we can recover a lot more easy. Oh, it was an honest mistake. You know, if we have affinitive trust and we like each other, oh, there's systems for what to do. We shut the water down. Here's the procedures we follow until it comes back up. It's very transparent. Everyone knows what happens. You can imagine that that's a better system than if those other 2 forms of trust don't exist. And I can go on and on with examples of that, but I'm kind of toward the end of my time here. What I want to lay out is something that we use for groups all over the place, and it seems to be helpful, is just to assess where you're at in your own governance situation, right? So something as simplistic as this, we found to be pretty enlightening for groups. So we might be working with a group that's trying to work with a community, and we just say, why don't you assess, think about these different 4 forms of trust. How is it in your situation? And it's amazing how often something as simple as this can reveal a huge gap. For example, wow, we've been focusing here on rational trust all this time, proving how smart we are and how competent we are and what the incentives will be. And we've completely not thought about affinitive trust, right? How to actually build relationships in the community, or creating a system where people feel safe to take the risk that we'd like them to take. So we found that this has worked quite well, actually, across continents. So South America, United States, Asia, even in Africa, that these categories of trust are all relevant. What's different is this right-hand column. So the actions I would take to build affinitive trust, let's say, in like Virginia, where I live, are quite different than the actions I would take in Indonesia. However, affinitive trust still matters in both of those cases. And the same with these other forms of trust. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. That's the idea I wanted to share. And I'll pass it off, and happy to take questions and talk about this as we go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stern. We can take a couple of questions right now and maybe move on to the, I guess, big picture questions towards the panel discussion. So
thank you so much for such interesting and I gain a lot of knowledge and understanding from the presentation. I'm curious if this framework not only apply to community, but also for different government entities, like because for water governance, you need forestry people, you need water, and sometimes you need infrastructure people to work together. And in the system where the underlying trust is low, like there is distrust in the government system, and that's this encouraging people to trust each other, even in between agencies. And how does this framework can be applied to increase collaboration? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question. Some of the research we've done on this framework has actually been in interdisciplinary teams. So imagine all the ologists you can imagine, or all the specialists, right? Interdisciplinary teams. How to actually get them to work together. So I even use this in group projects at Virginia Tech. I have my students think about these different forms of trust and how they can build and maintain them as they work together. So we found that this works internally for diverse teams to really think first and foremost about the systems they're going to create in which they can interact, and creating clear rules for how they're going to interact and what are the consequences if somebody doesn't. And setting that up ahead of time, as awkward as it may feel, can lead to huge gains as we go forward. And then it also works externally, just to think through. Again, like the very specific actions are going to vary from place to place, but these theoretical constructs tend to be extremely helpful for just thinking through, all right, how do we work with each other? How do we work with the public? How do we work with the politicians we're going to have to convince? In each case, doing a very simple analysis of these forms of trust can give us ideas for how we can work better with each other. And if you're interested, well, I'll figure out a way to get you my email, and I could send you lots of papers that kind of give ideas for this stuff as well.
I'll take one more question before we move to the next.
Thank you. My name is Angie, and I'm at the CBC in Atlanta. So this is a really insightful presentation that we probably don't talk quite enough about, to be honest with you. I'm working with a mixture of government, healthcare facilities, and a range of laboratories. So it's a mixture of stakeholders. I'm wondering how this paradigm shifts when you're working with somebody who has a bottom line, like healthcare facilities are a business, and what impacts that number value. Is there any shift in the questions that you ask? This may be a question you can answer right away. I know it's a deep one. But I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I really like that question because, I mean, it's quite different than thinking about purely public utilities and public entities, right? You know, one of the things that we've been working with is trying to figure out, you know, how do we get folks to understand each other's bottom line? Because everybody has a bottom line, right? We're all accountable to different entities and different outputs. So my work in the Forest Service, oftentimes in the United States, they're beholden to a certain number of board feet or a certain number of acres of riparian zone, just like a business would be accountable to a bottom line or shareholders. And one of the things we think really can help both rational and affinitive trust is sharing those accountabilities and concerns with other stakeholders, right? So if we make that transparent, like, hey, I want to work with you. Here's what I'm responsible for. Even if what I'm responsible for is like profit for my shareholders, then if I'm the person working with you, we can start to brainstorm. Well, like, all right, here's my stuff. How do we meet your goals and mine? Right? So it's not a dirty thing that somebody's trying to make a profit and somebody else is trying to do something else. But the more we lay out on the table, the more transparency we have, the easier we've seen it to work together. So oftentimes people will hold their cards close to their chest because they're afraid. They don't want to take that risk or that leap of faith, right? And in our situation, we find that actually laying it out and being a lot more transparent can lead to better outcomes. So I think sharing of accountabilities, and we've even thought about this as like accountability mapping. And so I would map out to whom I feel accountable in my position. And if every other stakeholder does that, and then we share our accountability maps, then we can work on helping each other achieve our accountabilities and our joint goals. Anyway, happy to talk more about that. But yeah, it's a challenge either way. And all this stuff, I'll say before my time is up, is that none of this is ever quick and there's no faking it, right? Like building trust, like, yeah, you could probably fake it for a week, 2, I don't know, short periods of time, but like it really does take tremendous commitment, tremendous patience, and just a genuine sort of humility and desire to actually be fair and honest with other people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stern. Thank you for your questions, and we have an opportunity towards the end to take some more. Now we move on to our next presenter, Dr. Mark Edwards. Dr. Mark Edwards is a University Distinguished Professor of Civil Engineering at Virginia Tech. His research group conducted the investigative science uncovering the 2001 to 2004 DC lead crisis and the 2014 to 2016 Flint water crisis. He was co-recipient of the inaugural 2017 MIT Disobedience Award, recipient of the 2018 AAAS Scientific Freedom and Responsibility Award, and the 2019 Hoover Humanitarian Medal. With that, I welcome you, Dr. Edwards.
Well, thank you. And let me just note a follow-up to Mark's great presentation that in many ways, the story of the last 2 decades is plummeting trust in Western institutions. And I am not able to advance. Let me try this again. Should I stop share and restart, or?
Yeah, maybe try that because you should be able to advance your own slides.
It's just not advancing here. Can you advance there, or? It was advancing during practice, so I'm not sure. Oh, okay, it's moving now, so I don't know what happened. So that is true in America, where in the last 2 years, trust in almost all institutions has reached record lows. It's also true in the water industry, where I think we can appropriately characterize what's happening as an epidemic loss of trust in tap water with horrifying implications. And most of those trace that back to one event, which is, of course, is the Flint, Michigan water crisis. And I want to put this episode into some historic context, and also talks about the dimensions of distrust that are associated with what happened in Flint. And I think it's important to note that when we are looking at adversity, we can look at it one of 2 ways. We can ask the questions, who did this to us, or what did we do wrong? And in a 2016 keynote at UNC Water Conference, I made the point that we have to look at ourselves, and that's hard to do. There's a history here, and it starts in Washington, D.C., where I was hired by the EPA to solve a simple lead in water problem. I was soon no longer working with the EPA, fixing that problem. And eventually I was able to show over the next 10 years that about 2,000 kids were not born. There were 200 fetal deaths and associated with this time period of high lead in water, and thousands of young children who were lead poisoned. The DC system is run completely by government agencies, and this was an environmental crime that occurred, and it was covered up by the EPA, the US Centers for Disease Control, and several other science agencies. And so this was a profound betrayal that I witnessed. It took me 7 years and $1 million, but I eventually was vindicated in a congressional hearing, which showed all of the above, which I said was true. And unfortunately, we didn't learn from that horrible episode in Washington, D.C. And if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And from 2003 to 2014, I spoke out against this because I knew that this was headed to a catastrophic loss of trust in the water industry and in our mission. Of course, you can imagine this was not received very well. But I do want to mention that this was, pretty horrible. I identified fabricated reports written by the CDC, EPA, Journal American Water Works Association. I just want to point out that a key character in the Flint saga, Miguel del Toro, who is the foremost expert on the lead and copper rule in the United States, he resigned from AWWA over their policies on lead and water in 2013. People from outside our industry wrote to Journal AWWA and AWWA talking about their horror that we would allow falsified scientific publications to be published and persist. And eventually I resigned from AWWA as well. And the message I got was good riddance. And that happened a month before Flint. And the Flint, Michigan water crisis occurred. Once again, it was completely owned by government agencies that were running the water system in Flint. There's no way you can ascribe this to some evil private industry with a profit motive. We worked as best we could to Miguel and I to expose this within the system. Miguel famously wrote after He tried to get EPA to intervene and was retaliated against, how upset he was about how EPA was not doing their job and that he hated working here because EPA is a cesspool. But at that point, it was kind of a war. It was a war to protect kids in Flint and people in Flint. And so if you're going to fight a war, you should fight it to win. That's what we did. There was a multi-pronged approach to our campaign. We sampled the water. We started blog sites. I did Freedom of Information Act requests, published the emails, horrifying emails of these government agencies. And within about 6 weeks, this was national and international news. And eventually President Obama declared a federal emergency and FEMA came in. We also found out that exactly what I was saying all along, the only thing unusual about Flint was they got caught and people cared. Many other cities were cheating on the lead and copper rule, just like in Flint. In fact, there were thousands of systems that had elevated lead or were violating the law. And so this is just to remind you of my 2016 UNC keynote that the early phases of this were absolutely, we did this to ourselves. And in the second phase, I spoke about in 2018, in that some opportunistic faculty went to Flint, drawn to it like opportunists to a light, made many false claims, including outrageous ideas such as the lead filters distributed by the agencies were killing residents in Workar and Shigella. We spoke out against that. If you're interested in what happened to us and how we were retaliated against for asking simple questions about that research, there's an article on retraction watch there, but that was 2018. So that brings us to the present, which I think we can now shift to. This has entered a new dimension where we can legitimately say, this thing has spiraled out of control, and we can look at others who are now doing this to us. And so it all starts with the fact that media activists and scientists exaggerated the health harm from Flint. Whether it's the New York Times, whether it's 60 Minutes, there's this narrative out there that the lead exposure in water caused permanent brain damage in children, and that's causing skyrocketing special education and other health problems. And the fact is, this is just a false narrative. We published an article on this last year, trying to speak out against this false narrative. And this is the data from the paper, which shows the blood lead in Flint, which is the red line, versus the average blood lead for all of Michigan versus nearby Detroit on the black line. And you see the shaded area here, which is the Flint water crisis, and that little blip in the red line. The effect of the Flint water crisis was to raise the blood lead of Flint children to the average for children in the rest of the state of Michigan. That should have been good news. It should have said, oh, we were great to intervene and to stop this elevation in blood lead before more harm could be done. Instead, good news is turned into bad news in this hyperbolic narrative media environment. We do think it's true that kids have been horribly harmed, but we don't think it's possible that it could be harmed by the lead. In fact, we argue that it was a nocebo effect, where if you tell poor Flint children for 8 years, lie to them and tell them they were subject to an unprecedented harmful lead exposure that did not occur, they will believe it. And it's called a nocebo effect, which is extremely powerful. And in a million years, you could never do an experiment on what we did publicly to Flint kids. It's horrifying. The second thing is we have to deal with a permanent health scare. And so this is, again, a good news situation turned into a bad news situation. The good news is that decades ago, we phased lead out of gas, paint, food, and water pipes. And what resulted is a 95% reduction in blood lead. If you go back to the 1970s, 100% of children still had blood level above 5 micrograms per deciliter. The bad news is that just as society makes progress on reducing lead exposure, the CDC reduces its blood lead threshold just as fast. And so now we've stopped formally taking steps to reduce it, and this threshold is now on wheels. And basically, it's now going to be set so that 2.5% of children are always above it. The official US government messaging or the interpretation of it you get is there's no safe level of lead. And I'm now in London at a health scares workshop where I presented what I consider to be a permanent health scare as a result of this messaging and policies. And so we spoke out against this in 2023 and suggest it's doing more harm than good. And I still believe that at present. The other thing is, once we lost our moral authority in Flint, there was a vacuum created. No one trusted the government agencies. No one trusted anyone from the water industry anymore. So people moved in and filled that vacuum. And one group that moved in was the American Academy of Pediatrics, who came out with this recommendation that water should never exceed 1 part per billion. And this sounds good, but if you know anything about modern plumbing, you'll know this is absurd because even modern plumbing cannot meet this standard. And so if you have a standard like this, you can't even replace antiquated plumbing in schools, but instead you have to rely on bottled water and filters. But we spoke out against this in 2018, pointed out that this is a serious downside, that it was leading to non-sustainable solutions and unrealistic expectations. Another thing that's happened, dimension of spiraling distrust arising from Flint, is that social science faculty and others who study this problem perpetuate the false narratives of horrific health harm in Flint. This is an article that actually compares what happened to Flint to what happened to people in Bhopal, India, and Minamama, Japan. And that's a hyperbolic exaggeration. And we spoke out against this in a publication that came out just a couple of weeks ago. So if you add up all this fallout, it's really quite horrifying. We lost the public trust due to our betrayal, and that was priceless. That lost trust has resulted in more bottled water use, expensive home filter purchases amongst our most vulnerable Americans. And that's something I am personally ashamed of, and I think our entire industry should be ashamed of it. We have impossible recommendations on top of a permanent health scare, all of which contributes to a nocebo effect. And the most recent manifestation of this, and you can argue both sides of this, is just last week, the Biden administration recommends that lead in drinking water pipes be replaced nationwide. Of course, there were once arguments that the cost of this did not justify the benefits, but once you consider the priceless loss of trust in Flint and DC and elsewhere, it's really out of our hands. It's beyond logic at this point. And so, yeah, speaking out in this third phase has cost me dearly. Trying to stop this third dimension of distrust that's created by the vacuum of our own failures, both government science agencies and our industry. I would pay any price to reverse that, but unfortunately what happened and it's hard to undo. I will say that science is highly politicized now, and rising above that takes courage, whether it's speaking out against what your own friends and institutions are doing, and also versus what other groups are doing to betray the public trust and to not speak truth with a capital T. What I have learned is lies, whether they're well-intentioned or not, always have a way of hurting people. And that's especially true of science lies. And even if they don't hurt people today, they can still undermine the trust that civilization depends on. And that's something we're going to have to deal with for the next many decades. So with that, if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Guess we can start taking any questions, Donor.
Thank you very much for such an amazing presentation. I was just wondering how, like, where would you go to from here? Like, thinking about the structure about forms of trust and how to build trust, which sounds all very kind of like positive and straightforward. And thinking of all these kind of chaotic external factors of the media and everything else. Like, how would you link the two together? Like, would you to kind of try and move forward in terms of like trust building using that structure that Mark Stern talked about?
Well, as our last speaker said, the first step to building trust is to stop betraying it. And a lot of this trust is justified, whether it was blamed on us or blamed on others, it has happened. And I just want to point how outrageous this betrayal is, because people actually created a system, created not-for-profit government agencies to oversee drinking water so that they would never have to distrust their water supply. And we were trusted until all of these outrageous things happened to betray it. And so now people are actually giving up their lives because they cannot trust the safety of their government supplied drinking water that comes from the tap. And the price was listed on all the last slide. Our poorest Americans are afraid of water, many times for no reason, but once you reach a tipping point, it happens, you can't go back, and they're spending their precious financial resources on bottled water and filters. So it's just a horrific spiral that we've allowed to occur. The only possible way out of it, in my opinion, is to be deserving of the public trust. And we've got a long way to go before we're even approaching that. Another point is you just simply can't create these public health scares. You can't set unreasonable standards that water utilities can never meet for, quote, safe drinking water. According to that current standard, as we pointed out in our editorial, there is no water in the United States that is safe. If you have this, there's no safe level of lead government mantra. And so I know it's with good intentions. Maybe it was once served its purpose, but the cost of that false messaging is just astronomical.
One more question.
Thanks, Mark. I work in the water industry, and I also have a personal connection because this Thursday I'll be holding a public forum in my neighborhood about lead contamination in our park. So working with NCDEQ, others, but I have a question for you is, how would you recommend we improve this messaging, like to the public? Like how do we improve the public to understand risk better? Because these, as you said, like these standards are unreasonable, but impossible to understandable. Thanks.
Well, I think first and foremost, the thing that concerns me, there's very little we can do to correct this narrative about Flint. I'm going to do everything in my power to do it, but once this narrative is created, it's almost impossible to put that genie back in the bottle. I think the industry's biggest concern should be stopping this no safe level messaging, not just for lead, but for PFAS. Once you have that paradigm, I just don't know how you can function when there's no safe water in America. For every other contaminant, except lead at first, we all sat in a room, people argued it out, and we decided on a level of that contaminant, which we would all agree is not very unsafe. That's the goal of a drinking water standard. When should I be concerned? Having a no safe level standard for PFAS, for lead, for no good reason, in my opinion, it's really putting us in an unwinnable position.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. We'll take some more questions towards the end, but for now, I will introduce our last presenter of this morning. Dr. Miriam Hacker serves as a research manager at the Water Research Foundation, building bridges between research and practice. Her research portfolio through the foundation focuses on projects related to utility management, workforce management, water reuse, and decentralized systems. Dr. Hacker earned her BS, MS, and PhD degrees in civil engineering at the University of Washington, with an emphasis in construction, energy, and sustainable infrastructure. Her professional experience includes local permitting, stormwater management, network development, and the housing water nexus. More recent research experience includes institutional and governance considerations for implementation of alternative water systems and community engagement best practices. With that, I'd like to
I feel like y'all picked the right session. This is, we could end right here and it'd be good to go. This is a big thank you to the last couple speakers, Dr. Stern, Dr. Edwards, and also you, Gasha, for bringing us all together and organizing this. I'm curious, while we get the PowerPoint set up, who do we have in the room? Can we start with folks that are students? If you're a student, can you just raise your hand? Okay, amazing. I am too. It's always good to go back and learn. I've done a little bit too much learning, but how about folks that are active practitioners in the water industry? Government? Other, feel free to yell, private companies? NGOs, thank you. You can tell, thank you. You can tell I go to, I work in the national US water industry, and there's a lot of private industries, you work with utilities. And so before we dig in, I really appreciate the last couple of talks that came in, because it sets the stage of how do you build or lose trust, but then what are the next steps? And so in the last few years, I've been working with water reuse, and for folks, we'll dig into what it is and whatnot, but what are the steps that you can take? And I would say that this type of event, just to do a little side tangent, this type of event is really unique. So I go to a number of conferences in the water sector, and usually there's that one small tract on communication. And that's where all the engagement goes in there. And I would argue that communication is not the same as engagement. It's not the same as participation. And the fact that there's dedicated sessions, more than one, to governance and what do those decisions look like is really huge here. And so I just want to take the opportunity here to learn from the folks around us. You saw folks that raised their hand. Everyone is coming in with an experience that we can learn from each other. The other thing that I'll say is when we think about trust, let's look at how, I'll bring in the utility perspective, but why don't we take a look at how utilities are set up? For years, and I tell folks, I'm a civil engineer who tripped into social science. Quickly on, the data wasn't there. We decided to do some legitimacy studies on why they didn't have the data and how they were making decisions. And it turned into a whole rabbit hole for me in my career. So usually when we think about community engagement, you think about trust. And a lot of it is understanding why or why not do community members trust the decisions that you're making from a utility standpoint. And what's not as clear, or maybe what I've seen a lot of research, is that when you understand the perceptions or whether or not someone trusts your infrastructure, the next recommendation that comes in your paper is, well, you need to engage them. But engage them how? And to what extent? And if you look at how utilities are set up, for years, they've been providing critical services behind the scenes. It's been a lot of engineers doing the technical operations and maintenance and development, capital improvement programs. Where's the communication? It's been very internal facing. And in recent years, at least in the US, it started to become more external facing. Utilities are now starting to be seen as anchor institutions of the community. They're part of the fabric of a community organization. And even from what we heard from Dr. Edwards, that's for better or for worse. If you're not communicating with the community that you serve, there's an opportunity to either break or build that trust with folks. And so if we think about even just the resources and capacities are going towards this trust development, if you think about your own organization or where you'd like to work, is there someone dedicated to workforce development? If you have people from your community that are working in your organization, that can help with building trust because people are involved in what they see happening. At the same time, it's building that economic development in your local community. How about in communication? And we'll go into this a little bit more. So how many folks have heard of water recycling? Okay, it's okay. We're not going to dig into the science of it today. That's totally fine. But where I sit kind of in this picture, and this is a very oversimplified overgeneralization, is the institution side. So we can understand a lot about perceptions. And in terms of water recycling, it's when you take some type of source water. A really overgeneralized definition of this would be, hey, you take wastewater from your community, you treat it to an advanced level, and then you use it or repurpose it for another use. So in some cases, people use it for irrigation, they can use it for toilet flushing, it can be on-site, it can be centralized. In some cases, you have something called direct potable reuse, where you inject it into your aquifers, or there's only a few out there right now that send it directly from the advanced treatment plant directly to the drinking water treatment plant. We have a perception problem. If you take a look, you cannot do a trust and governance conversation without some news articles. A little story is there is a utility in the US that was taking the media through their plant that they were going to commission about 10 years ago. And the media officers talked to one of the operators at the facility, and they're like, well, would you drink the water? It was going to be direct, indirect potable. Person's like, absolutely not. Set the project back millions of dollars and 10 years, not because of that one person, but because when you're thinking about developing trust, someone brought up a really great question. It's not only internal legitimacy, it's external legitimacy as well. And I think sometimes people pursue the trust with the community first, realizing that they have internal ambassadors in their organization. And so what do we do with this? There's a lot of terms being thrown around and by me. But you understand perception, you know it impacts trust, you know that sometimes engagement helps, and sometimes part of that is communication, but where do we go from there? So part of a 4-year EPA funded project, we're looking at community engagement for water reuse. And really the goal was, how do we establish a baseline? How do we bring together best practices for doing it? And I had the opportunity, I'm still working with Professor Anais Roque, she's actually in the middle of transitioning at Duke. This month. So, but really what we started doing was, well, first off, when we talk about community engagement, who's your community? Does that change based on the type of project you're doing? And can we articulate that? And also, what do you mean by engagement? And so what you'll see by the end of this talk is there's a few examples of how people are considering it. And we want to bring in a theoretical framework as well. Can we think about this a little bit differently beyond just communication? So we went through, we were establishing a baseline. Right now we're doing regional workshops, which has been amazing. And what we're finding is this big influx of agencies realizing that trust is the ultimate end goal. So I'll cut to the chase. We did these interviews. They're really interesting. And being able to hear the differences was incredible. You're also able to see that we were able to cover different types of water reuse, including indirect, direct, agricultural, industrial, on-site water reuse. And what we found was that we asked people, so what would successful engagement look like for you? Trust or a successful project. Okay. How? Not quite sure, but community meetings do help. That happens quite a bit. But what about how you're defining the community? We saw that there were some blurred lines. When you're dealing with a huge capital improvement project like a water recycling plant, a lot of times your first community members are actually stakeholders in regulation. You're working a lot more with the regulators where regulations might not exist yet, or you're the first person going through it in the process. And you're having to work with politicians, regulators, as well as operators, as well as other agencies, because you're signing agreements. And then later in the process, when you figure out the feasibility and technical details, you might be working with those end users or folks that are ratepayers. So that was some initial things that we found. We started to think about what if we took, and this has been developed through the International Association for Public Participation. What if we thought about engagement through the level of participation? So this has been well established, and we wanted to not reinvent the wheel, but you might think on one end, you might just be informing someone, communicating what you're going to do. You might end up consulting them, maybe getting a little bit of feedback, involving them in that decision that's being made, collaborating with them on how that works, or the ultimate level of engagement might be empowerment. So using what we found from these interviews, we actually took what we got from the interviews and we transposed them on here. Now we're doing regional workshops to kind of get some initial feedback from folks. Does that make sense? Does that not? And I will say that this is what we initially had. So if you're thinking about some strategies that people are already exercising, we have some. We're getting more. It's very exciting. But at the same time, realizing that it's not a silver bullet. There's not one thing that's just going to automatically gain trust. And exactly like the other two speakers have talked about, it's an ecosystem. You need internal champions. You need community ambassadors. You need different touch points with the community. I knew of one utility that was doing a water recycling plant. They needed letters of support from community members. They would just get to know their community unrelated to the project. And then when the project came around, like to the point where they were giving out turkeys at Thanksgiving, has nothing to do with water recycling. However, when the project came around, the community members were like, I don't totally get the plan, but also I trust you, so I'll sign on. And the goal isn't the blind trust. You want people to feel informed and engaged on how things are moving forward. And at the same time, you want to develop that affinity. And I really appreciate the ecology of trust. That's amazing. So what are the barriers to trust? Well, if you see here, what we found from folks that we were working with is it's stacked a little bit more on just the communication side. And we asked people why. What's going on here? Why are you having a challenge? And even in the workshops, we were realizing empowerment is a really difficult thing for engineers and for utilities, because the assumption was that they're making one key decision on a highly technical, highly complex infrastructure project. And they didn't necessarily think that made sense, or that didn't align with having community members do it. I'd also argue that some community members would say, why are you asking me to decide about a highly complex infrastructure project when you're getting paid to do that? So what we're trying to reframe here isn't so much whether or not the community decides on water reuse, but rather what are the decisions along the way that can help improve the decisions. So what we've been asking in our workshops here is, are there decisions that you can bring to the community that they can make in association with this reuse project? And do they have trust in the fact that you've done the due diligence on making sure the science is sound, making sure that it's feasible, it makes sense for your community, that they have transparency on how it affects their costs and their rates going forward, because it will. I think the biggest challenge is if you say it won't, it will, absolutely. We don't value water in the US the way we should, and so it's a lot cheaper to just do the conventional treatment systems. The other thing that I think was really interesting from Dr. Edwards' talk is on the levels of treatment. So there have been a number of perception studies done on how much do people trust recycled water and its safety. That's always the concern. It's always the concern of regulators as well. We want to make sure that people feel safe, they're healthy, same with the environment. It's usually on a scale of level of contact. So the types of reuse that are more direct contact, like direct potable, or if it's not regulated, if it's being used for toilet flushing, or maybe irrigation's a little bit more acceptable because you're not touching it as much. For on-site water reuse, if you're using it for toilet flushing, maybe that's a little bit more concerned. People are a little bit okay with that though, rather than using it for laundry. And so that's been some studies. We've been able to gauge how people think and perceive about interacting with reused water. The challenge is, though, is the regulations that are getting made to address that. And so recently we've seen across the US, there have been different states that are creating regulations for direct potable reuse. And it's extremely conservative numbers, very conservative. There's been a lot of research. The foundation has worked with scientists and experts across the world to be able to come up with what are the safe values of treatment for these types of systems. And even though we do have some of that research and it is being informing those decisions, we're still seeing extremely conservative values come out. And so to that point of regulation, it's looking at what is safe, and how does that impact cost? Because when you're talking about trust with community members, it also comes down to what can they afford? We're also seeing studies showing that people can't afford their utility bills every month the same way that they used to back in the day. So how do we account for the environmental justice or injustice of providing basic services with the need to be sustainable and creating more resilient communities? So that being said, it's not just in the communication, it's in the participation. And what we're excited about is figuring out, are there tangible solutions that aren't necessarily coming from the scientists themselves, but are coming from the utilities. They're getting really creative, getting really innovative. I thought it was really interesting. One of the folks are doing a podcast now, and it's on YouTube. Very exciting stuff. And you get to talk to folks behind the scenes that before it was like the Wizard of Oz. People are working behind the scenes to make sure things happen. You don't know about it until something goes wrong. But what if we flip that script a little bit and start improving trust through transparency? I would say in general, the utilities I work with, it's really well intentioned. They're trying to do the right thing, but how do we align the intentions between community members and between the utilities that are providing those basic services. The other big critical point to overcome that barrier of entrusting folks with really complex decisions about infrastructure is thinking about what are the decisions that you can actually place in the hands of your community members that bring them alongside, so that you're moving forward together rather than spending about 7 years doing feasibility studies and then having all of that stop because all of a sudden you started to engage the community and they hadn't heard about it before. So I just want to give a big thank you to my co-lead assistant professor Anais Roque. And I will say, for the students in the room and the researchers, one thing that I've learned along the way is, you know, my background's engineering, but a lot of times we got to bring in social scientists. And so I was super stoked on this project because Professor Roque comes in from anthropology background, environmental science background, and you can bring a different perspective. And even over the last 3 talks, I've heard messaging from psychology, organizational studies, neo-institutional theory, other social sciences, and it takes a group of folks together. And for the folks that are doing the research, you're a part of the process. There is no objective observers here. What you publish influences folks. One recent example we have is from, there were some psychologists, I think anyways, someone posted a journal article about birth defects from DPR, direct potable reuse. Literally in the first abstract sentence, it says there's non-significant findings. And yet no one reads that. All they see is there's birth defects because of reuse. And so what I would ask from the community of researchers, academics, folks that are publishing is that you are part of the group. So when you're publishing, be intentional with what you're putting out there and the potential impacts it has. Even though funders are looking for the biggest, most critical problems, doesn't mean that we should sensationalize things if it's not accurate. So that's something that I've learned along the way. And again, thanks for the folks here and thanks for organizing. But if folks have questions, happy to answer 1 or 2.
Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. Do you agree? Oftentimes engineering comes from the perspective of this is an engineering problem and stumble upon this is not an engineering problem. I'm curious about the situation where a water utility themselves are struggling from inside to, we learned from previous presentations, stop betraying to increase trust, but they're inside themselves are struggling to stop betraying, are struggling to improve themselves, and how to balance between, or what should they do? Do they need to reach out to the community or start fixing themselves from inside or fixing the system they're part of, that the underlying trust is low, corrupt things still going on, and where should people start? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question about where do you start? Internal, external, trust building. And I would say, you know, I don't know that it's an all or nothing. I also don't think that there's an exact way you should do it, but I might recommend you might have more success starting internally. Get your house in order before you start going out to community members, because you need those internal ambassadors. It's the informal conversations where people trust rather than like people know when they're getting sold something. You know, when you've hired a consulting firm to tell you what to communicate, people understand that. They know what's happening. But if you've got your friend who works at the local utility and you're asking him, so for example, I was in Tennessee the other week and they're like, oh, you do water stuff, so do you drink the tap? That was the first one. It was a gotcha question. I was like, I do. Depends on the city though. And like, ask about the distribution systems. Then we had a great conversation about treatment and how it usually is really good. And so those informal conversations are where the most impact is done. And there's a lot of studies from network theory about the greatest influence isn't from celebrities or influencers. It's sometimes from micro influencers, people in communities.
Thank you, Donald Robertson from the University of Strathclyde. I really enjoyed the presentation and you know, all that kind of thinking you presented. My question is about reflections on, so a lot of the conversation has been about communities and having trust in institutions. And the first graphic you put on was that sort of two-way kind of arrows. I really like that. So I was just wondering if you had reflections on institutional trust in communities. to be involved in the process and to, for example, things like provide feedback and data? And if you've experienced any challenges with that.
Tell me more about that. Institutional.
So there's a kind of relationship between communities having trust in institutions, but institutions also being willing to accept engagements with communities, and where it's not seen as we'll just have this meeting to get their trust. It's more of can they offer something to us?
Yeah.
Is there that mutual, developing that mutual trust, rather than just a one directional?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So I've been digging into public administration a little bit through this route. And what I'm noticing is that a lot of times water utilities like to see themselves as like the water sector, but the reality is a lot of them are built into the larger government system. And so that plays a role into engaging with the community. They don't necessarily delineate between like, oh, well, that's the water person. They're like, oh, no, that's the government. And so in terms of what you're talking about, the transactional nature of engagement with the community, one quick story I have. Okay. One quick story is that during the interviews, we were talking with folks about what they were doing differently. And this one government was saying, they're used to the normal things. We actually have the folks that are really used to when we do a public hearing, they show out, they do support, not support on this project. And so we did something a little different where we did an informational meeting and the normal folks showed up that they're used to getting. And they're like, okay, so like, what's the project though? And they're like, well, we haven't decided yet. We haven't decided on the project. They're like, yeah, but like, so what are we voting for or against? And I'm like, none. Like, we're just telling you that we might think about it, just as a heads up ahead of time. And so to your point about engaging, there's also this, I don't know if folks are familiar with the term path dependency, but there's this path dependency where like, the folks from the community that are going to come in, who you can rely on, but sometimes when you do something new with how you engage with folks, it also means breaking those norms a little bit. And it's a bit of a bumpy road. So in the same way that they expect the same people, if you're seeing the same people over and over, is that representative of your community? And how do you bring in the professionals, the engagement professionals that can help diversify who is being represented in those decisions? And at the same time, your community that's really used to the certain ways you're doing it through compliance-based actions might need some transition period to understand you're doing things differently as well. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but I think it does go back to the internal legitimacy of like retraining how we think about things. Engagement isn't an afterthought. It really is driving it, because you can lose a lot of money and a lot of time on not taking the public seriously in your projects. And I think some of that comes from ambassadors in your organization. It comes from leadership and your organizational culture. And those aren't things that change overnight. That's a whole other conversation. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of our three presenters. Thank you so much for your time and for the engaging discussions. I'd like to open the floor for discussion, but maybe I can start off with the first question. And I know, Dr. Edwards, you have to head out a little sooner than the rest of us. So maybe I'll start with you. Is there something, is there something called as too much transparency? And could we have too much of it? In the sense that instead of building trust, it starts eroding trust. Just curious about your thoughts on that. And I would love for Dr. Stern and Dr. Hacker to also join in to that question.
I couldn't hear that, so have someone else answer it right now, and I'll pick up on it.
Sure.
Yugasha, was the question, can there be too much trust or can there be too much transparency?
And there'll be too much transparency to the point where it might be eroding trust rather than building
Unfortunately, I
it.
couldn't hear the question, so.
I'm happy to repeat it. I was asking if there is something called as too much transparency, in the sense that instead of building trust, it erodes trust.
Yes, I think that's quite likely. I think if we really studied this in the years ahead, that we're going to learn that having community participation is not always going to lead to better outcomes. Part of that might be the process, but part of it, I think, starts with the fundamental perspective that this system was set up, especially in water governance, so that people would not have to worry about their water, that they created a system that they could trust. And the very act that they need to participate in it to make sure that we're trustworthy is itself creating a lot of anger. So anyway, I don't know that to be true. I suspect it to be true. I think there's community participation done right. There's community participation that's going to be done wrong. Just as our earlier speaker said, social scientists are great. Well, I can give you examples of social scientists who live to destroy trust. If you doubt me, please send me an email and I will give you a number of publications to prove that very point. So if you're going to involve a social scientist, make sure it's one that actually has a goal of creating more trust. But yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. Are going to lead to better outcomes or not?
Thank you. Anybody else wants to join in, or we can also transition to all the folks here?
I'll just show up. Yeah, okay. Here we go. I'll just say really quickly, in specific projects for use, yes. You need to understand, one example I give folks is if you have me come up to you and I say, hi, and you're like, hello, and hi, I'm engaging you. And you're like, okay, for what? Yeah, but are you engaged now? And you're like, you're just talking to me with no purpose in mind. That's sometimes how our engagement projects go, where it's like, okay, I'm gonna leave now, but you've been engaged and this has been successful. And it feels very transactional. It makes no sense. And they actually trust you much less now because you didn't have a purpose in mind. And so I think the too much transparency is exactly that, where be really intentional with why you're reaching out to people. What's the purpose in mind? What's the goal? Is it at an accessible level of language, or do they need an engineering degree to understand your message? Because otherwise, those small interactions at the beginning slowly build up to whether or not they listen to you or are receptive later.
Thank you to all the speakers. Really fascinating lens on trust in institutions. My question is for Dr. Edwards, but informed by the set of presentations. Dr. Edwards, you seem genuinely concerned about eroding trust and working towards building trust in institutions and in our water governance. Genuine question, how do you see this as compatible with sharing quotes like EPA is a cesspool? Like that's a quote that does not engender trust in me. So how do you see, the Flint crisis had this pendulum effect. Do you think quotes like that are a pendulum? How do you see that as consistent?
Well, we have to start with ourselves. And the reality is we have failed. And until we admit we have failed and we reform these agencies so they are worthy of the trust, until we stop punishing whistleblowers and rewarding these folks who perpetrated these crimes, none of whom were punished, by the way, I don't trust these agencies. Okay, so until you have reform, I'm not going to go out and lie to people and say that we're deserving of the public trust because I know it's not true. Flint happened. I'm sorry it did. I paid a horrible price to stop it. But until we reform, all is lost.
I think I can chime in on this one as well. I think there's a big literature out there that's growing on trust repair. What Dr. Edwards is involved in is this, that's where we are, right? Like trust is lost and repair is way harder than building from a lack of trust. You have to build from distrust. And what that literature tells us is the very first thing is taking responsibility for harm done, which is a little bit different than accepting blame. Sometimes it should be accepting blame, right? Like, yep, we did that. But it's accepting responsibility for harm done. And then there's these two tracks. So one is distrust regulation. So it's putting in voluntary apparatuses to keep us from violating the trust again. So this can be external monitoring, collaborative monitoring, transparency of meetings, things like that. And the other is trustworthiness demonstration. So actually proving that you are going above and beyond to fix the problem. So an example I like to use is when it was Volkswagen got caught, cheating on emissions in their car lines. And basically what they did is they accepted responsibility. They went out and they voluntarily took in third-party monitors to make sure that they wouldn't be able to do that again. So that's the distrust regulation side. And then they went ahead and actively paid for recalls of every single automobile and went ahead and fixed the issue. And yeah, they're still surviving now. I'm not saying that it's good, but it's an example of like these parallel tracks. And in this case, it's super hard for folks to accept the responsibility because what happened seems pretty dang egregious. And as soon as there's elite capture, where you've got media and politicians purposefully polarizing the issue for political gain, it gets a lot tougher to really figure out where to hit it within a network sort of situation. And I do think it just takes a lot longer to start to repair that.
Thank you. We're at time, but if you see us around, come say hello and we will engage with you. Related to trust. And we've got your email ID, so we're happy to send in kind of an email just to kind of create a network of all of us and hope to see you around. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done. This is very
Dr. Stan, Dr. Edwards, thank you so much. We're going to start with now. I'll catch up with you on email.
Okay, thanks, Yugasha. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yeah, I got put my phone there.
I saw multiple questions. Virginia Tech, I'm also from Virginia Tech. Like, and I don't know people, like I know Mark, but because I'm in the civil department, but I was just like, and I don't know people from Virginia Tech. I used to work. Do you work in?
We do.
Grant?
I think
you.
so.
I'm not
Feeling. Abhilasha from IHS India. Oh, yes.
Oh,
we
okay.
have.
No. Oh, that's you
Too.
Yeah.
Are you presenting or do you have a? Yeah, we have a like side event. Okay. About 4.
Okay.
From today, Thursday. Okay.
Okay.
Great session. I had some questions, but yeah. Yeah, so I can actually share my email ID with you.
Oh, no, there's so many things going on. It's really awesome to like figure out who else is doing what in what space, because indirect is gonna be the next. Yeah. Yeah, it's happening already, but like, I'm seeing it in terms of regulation. People are like, okay.
And that's kind of what my lab, I feel like that's where we're at right now, but with like probably under less, more so looking at things that maybe aren't yet, but might need to be.
Awesome.
When we can be.
It's very cool.
But just the University of Washington.
Yeah.
Research, you know, Bethany Gordon.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't know her like crazy, but
Okay.
we've been introduced. She's great.
Okay, I was just curious that bundle, so.
Yeah.
No.
What was your name?
Sydney.
Sydney, Miriam, nice to meet you.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll catch you.
Yeah, totally.
Yes,
Thank you.
I have
Abhilasha, nice to meet you.
I have a question. So.
Yes.
Okay, the reason. Yeah, I will give an example for yes. Yes. Which has so many issues over the past several decades, and there are so many researchers, academicians, the government, the NGOs going there continuously to do like initiatives. I mean, you find it really difficult to build a trust in the community because like one of the mentioned was water testing. And when we were going to test, they were like, oh, that's not bad. People will come over the past.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Well, and oversaturation, I've seen that too. I think that erodes trust as well.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, well, you're just gonna come extract and then leave.
Exactly.
And I don't ever see what happens with what I've given you.
Yeah.
And so a little bit of sovereignty. And so what we've seen in communities, I used to work up in Philly, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and what we found was having an intermediary, like if the government's really trying to do something, if they can help fund an intermediary group to serve on behalf and represent the community, So they're not having to
Yes.
deal with everyone that comes in. And
Yes.
that trust is in that intermediary. That
Yeah.
can help. Is there one there?
No, it's not possible because the population is about 1.5 lakh and 3,000 households. So it's crazy. So what something we are trying to do is that we have some community meetings in which we report back about our system. And we give them the report out of our meeting with the local council. So we try to do things like this, but it's really challenging.
Until there's someone who's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
It's gonna stay the same,
Yeah.
is what we
But
found.
it's interesting to reflect on that framework and other things to present
Yeah.
in this. We also first take that.
Yeah, and one, and like, so, for example, like, there's this idea of sovereignty and data collection of, how people providing their experiences is inherently valuable to researchers and governments, but are they receiving compensation for it? And so I think if you're not able to set up an intermediary, how are people being benefited from benefiting you as a researcher? Because I did some work in Lebanon. It was the same thing. That I'd sit down with people and they'd be like, yeah, you're like not the first researcher.
Exactly.
We've had so many researchers here. You guys come, then you leave and all this stuff. And it really changed my mind about how I worked. And that was a really big lesson for me of, okay, how are people benefiting? And is it really to their benefit or is it for mine? So there's no simple answer to
Yeah,
it.
I
but
know.
The awareness is good that that's happening for sure.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, yeah.
Yes.
And I just want to know what this student like us on decolonization.
Yeah.
Also has elements of watch, it's on Spotify. What to give it a listen. Yeah.
I just wait for the podcast from trust, and we're gonna do on decolonization.
Yeah.
I want these.
Yeah, we need.
Hey, no, I'll fill that, that's good.
It's lovely, I really loved.
Thanks.
So my PhD, I am looking at a lot of like community and participation.
Amazing.
And I also work in the water sector, Indian water sector for decades, so.
Amazing.
Well,
There's a lot of really good stuff happening over in India that I feel like we can learn a lot. Especially in the decentralized and like, just like a lot of initiatives that are going on. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think because now I'm doing the research, I'm just questioning everything at this point, and I just came back from my field work. And I feel like, is this participation even working? Is this decentralization working? Is this evolution doing?
But that's healthy. I mean, like, I look back on my past work and I'm like, oh, that was not the best way to do that. That was not the best approach nor great. We could always do better, so. Not saying that that's where yours is, but yeah, what, kind of.
So I'm thinking of women's engagement and women's participation, which is almost like prescriptive.
Mhm.
Women have to participate and that just becomes a box ticking exercise, tokenism and all of this. So that's.
No,
what I'm
totally.
looking at. Yeah.
Well, and especially when you have things like UN Women and like the different initiatives where it has become that checkbox. It does, like, that's the thing in that framework, that participatory framework.
Yeah.
One question that we're gonna meet up with local leaders is to ask, so how much do you want to be engaged? Because
Right.
we're assuming you want to be empowered, but do you want to be?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm wondering, did you find something similar with the ladies?
Yeah, but also, how do we see empowerment, right? So somewhere
Yeah,
for women, you also see that right from information as well, like throughout that ladder. And for a lot of our prescriptive policy to say, oh, you are empowered only towards the end, is just invisibilizing their agency already. So,
Agreed.
Yeah.
we saw that a little bit too, like
Yeah.
a lot of the folks we've talked with were really uncomfortable with empowerment. And so they use this term a lot where they'd be like, well, I actually think education is empowerment. And I was like, it could be, but
Yeah.
you're still just communicating with them. So
Yeah.
how are they communicating back to you?
True.
And so it sounds similar to,
Yeah.
I don't have the answers, but it is interesting to think about how like discomfort is changing how I interact with people.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'll keep educating.
True, and before I go on, I
Yeah.
wanted to say if you wanted a sticker. This
Love
is
it.
A student-led podcast.
Nice.
On decolonization.
Love it.
But touches aspects of like war.
No, love it.
I think there's an episode on environment and climate change, which.
No, it's amazing. No,
It's on Spotify.
No, I started out in civil engineering because I want to do humanitarian development.
Oh, how lovely.
And then I realized that if I did, I would feel very much like I was colonizing. And so I took a step back.
Really like our podcast and I really hope. you
That's why I came
follow
back
that
to the
too.
US. Yeah, no, I went back to the US because I was like, we have our own communities that aren't
Right.
doing well. And
Yeah, yeah.
am I
yeah,
okay
yeah.
with helping our communities at home?
Yeah, yeah,
Or
yeah.
is it only doing